Welcome back to another edition of Focus One. Today we're going to talk about the political influence of labor unions. On June 5th, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker survived a recall election that was initiated in response to the governor's union-busting agenda. Many pundits have lamented the outcome as a Waterloo for labor and the beginning of a new era of corporate dominance. Are they right? To help me answer this question and to take a broader historical look at some of the most salient sources of political influence on the left and on the right, I've invited Dr. Brendan Goff, visiting professor of history at New College of Florida, onto this week's show. Welcome to the show, Brendan.
Thank you, Frank. Pleasure to be here.
One of the ways that I like to start off, especially if I have a professor on the show, a colleague, we're interesting folks, and we're just more than what we are at the moment. Just to take a little look at the road that you've traveled to get here at New College. So just tell me a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, it was not a direct route to becoming a professor in history, that's for sure. I went to Hamilton College for undergrad. It's a small liberal arts school in upstate New York. And I knew upon graduation that I wanted to go for graduate school down the road for something, but I didn't know exactly what. And I finished, and I spent 4 months right after graduation working in Philadelphia in a very poor neighborhood as a school teacher, essentially. And it was a very kind of existential moment, because I really, all that you think you learn about in college, suddenly the reality hits you, and you see families and children growing up in very challenging environment, and you realize, well, it's just not theory, it's for real. And so because of that, I decided to go to look into seminary programs. Some of the people that I was working with were involved with Princeton Theological Seminary and other programs. And after kind of shopping around over the course of a year, I decided to go to about the cheapest school I could possibly find and still get about the same education as I would have gotten at, say, Princeton Theological. And that was a place up in Boston. And the interesting thing about that place, the name is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And the tricky thing about that place is that, just as the name implies, it's two-sided. The Gordon side was fairly conservative, an evangelical background, and the Conwell side was a fairly liberal theological seminary that had been based in Philadelphia. So I went inside my own head kind of with two minds, and here I went to a seminary that also had a kind of institutional background that was similar. And I had the chance to engage with a lot of professors of very different theological backgrounds, political stripes, and at the tail end of that program, I got to do a semester for seminarians at American University. And it was a chance to kind of see the political landscape for all of Washington, D.C. And it was a great opportunity to, again, kind of think out. And from that, I realized I did want to go back for a PhD, but I didn't really know any better at that point what I wanted to do. But after living abroad in Scotland and Spain for a couple of years, I really wanted to live abroad. After doing that and studying some philosophy, I realized if I were to do a PhD, it would be in American history, and it would be an opportunity to kind of get to the bottom of how a neighborhood like the one I'd lived in Philadelphia became that way. And how was it that the political landscape that I saw in Washington, D.C. through that seminary program, how did it get to be that way? And these are historical questions. How did this get to become this way? So that personal journey became the guide for that intellectual journey, which led to the PhD program at the University of Michigan and led me to New College of Florida.
Oh, and we're happy to have you, here. So our topic today is we're going to start off by looking at the results in Wisconsin, and again, the lament on the part of the left for this is being pitched by some as a Waterloo for labor. Take me back a little bit to sort of what you view as the heyday of labor unions, and then let's just kind of move on through to today, and then just try to make some sense of how significant those results were.
Well, I guess you could look at the heyday of the labor union movement. If you could just look at the percentage of membership of of unions with respect to the entire labor force. And
was it about a third at the height?
yeah, in the mid-50s, it was about 35%. And so if you take that as your marker of labor unions in their heyday, then that would be the period, 1950 through until the mid-1970s.
And how, with respect to public and private sector, unions had a very big presence in both sectors, obviously the public sector, but in the private sector. Now today, if we fast forward, what percentage of Americans belong to a union?
Funny you should ask. I was just looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics the other day for the same reason. I was curious because of what happened in Wisconsin. Unions make up 37% of the public sector, whereas unions make up only 6.9% of the private sector. So in other words, there's approximately a five-fold difference between the percentage of unions in the public sector versus the private sector. But more telling, I think, is that in 2010, about 2010, you had the first time, the tipping point, where the actual number of public sector union members outnumber private sector. So it's 7.6 to 7.8, or I'm sorry, 7.6 million public sector union members and 7.2 million.
So even though it's a higher percentage of the public sector belongs to a union, and you had a smaller in the private sector, the private sector is so dominant in terms of its size.
Right, 6.9% is equal to 7.2 million in the private sector, and 7.6 million is equivalent to 37% in the public sector. And then of that, of those public sector union members, 43% are local government employees, of the teachers, the firefighters, and the policemen that have become so lightning rods.
So overall, labor, the percentage of American workforce that belong to unions has declined, especially in the private sector. And we had Governor Scott Walker come into Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin, I think, a little bit more of a progressive tradition than some other states. Union presence is a little stronger there than in some of the other states. And he pursues a fairly aggressive agenda with assistance from Republicans in the legislature up in Wisconsin. Walk me through what happened in 2011. What set the stage for this recall election?
Well, in February of 2011, you have, within a matter of weeks of Governor Walker coming into office, you had the passage of a law that, what was it? I think it's 10, number 10, or I think is the number, but it was an omnibus bill, and well, actually it was a series of laws, but there was one bill in particular that was targeting public sector unions and basically raising obstacles to their collective bargaining, to their right to collective bargaining. There are specific ways in doing that, and you know, you put two things together, and you end up with a campfire, so to speak, and that was that you had Governor Walker with a fairly clear agenda, excuse me, legislative agenda, and you mix that with a very well established culture of union activity or union activism, political activism and organizing, and you put the two together, and it was designed to be confrontational. Now, where that confrontation would go was anyone's guess. As it turned out, you had the famous scenes, well, now famous scenes, with these public sector union members coming into the state capitol, and
some of the Democratic state legislators leaving the state.
Yep.
And why did they do that?
Because they could avoid quorum with details. Now that's happened in other states for other legislative issues. Texas, for example, with years before, and I think Indiana had happened.
So high drama in Wisconsin. Walker essentially gets what he wants in terms of getting. Well,
just quick question, a quick point about the context, because remember, this is going on at the same time as the Arab Spring is coming out, and you know, there was this kind of sense of cross-pollination almost between, you know, Egypt.
I thought that was a bit of a stretch at the time.
Yeah, but you know, when you think about, because they actually were seeing each other.
Yeah, no.
And then they're being presented as coeval, contemporaneous media events. It's just
So
kind of
Walker
funny.
essentially gets what he wants. And then the unions strike back. They collect enough signatures to hold
A million.
a recall election. An enormous amount of money is pumped into that state, especially on the conservative side from outside Wisconsin. And on June 5th, Walker wins by about 6 or 7 points. So given the failure of the labor unions and the Democratic Party within the state of Wisconsin to remove Walker from office, what should we make? Even how significant was it for Walker to hold on? What sort of message does that send? Is this a Waterloo, or is the left overreacting?
Well, only 2 governors in U.S. history have ever been successfully recalled. Gray Davis in 2003, I guess it was, and I had to look this one up. Governor Lynn Frazier from North Dakota in 1921 was successfully recalled, even though some 4 or 6 years earlier he had won the election at 79%. And it was an unusual situation with the drought hitting and the post-World War I kind of depression setting into the area, so an extreme set of circumstances. So history was kind of against having it, making a success of it. It's a very hard thing to do. It gets complicated because it becomes a question of who can who can make the best case for cause and effect, right? What caused the failure or what caused the success? So for example, what caused the success of Governor Walker? You could simply say, well, it's very hard to within 1 year to pull off a recall like that. It's very hard to do. You could blame it, you could blame it on the 7-to-1 fundraising advantage. There was 2/3 of which of that money came from out of state, and some people have argued that, well, Walker was going to win because he could just outspend and outfund.
There was something kind of intriguing in the exit polls, actually, in terms of what might have been the most significant factor in terms of Walker holding on, which was people are just not happy with recall votes. In a way, it was a protest against the actual recall vote rather than an endorsement of Scott or, again, a rejection of labor unions or anything of that.
That's right. And it's a tricky thing because the recall is one of many kind of historical artifacts from the progressive era. Right, and it's a chance. It was something that was devised to allow the possibility of removing an extremely corrupt or egregiously corrupt public official. And you could say a lot of things about Governor Walker, but he almost didn't even have enough time to be corrupt and have it exposed to justify a recall. You could make that case that the recall wasn't successful simply because the real purpose behind a recall is that kind of extreme situation, and this was a different kind of situation, and it just, there was a mismatch there.
Let me come back to I just want to come back to the idea of political influence and Governor Walker's agenda. Let me just throw that, where did that come from? Because it looks somewhat similar to agendas that are pursued statewide throughout the United States. You know where I'm going, so just let's talk a little bit
let's
about
just say these laws that were being presented to the state legislature almost upon arrival at the state capitol, that many of these laws were not exactly the products of Governor Walker's imagination. He got a lot of help. And in fact, it's not a secret now it's not a secret so much where he got this.
The American Legislative Exchange.
These
legislative Tell me a little bit
agendas.
about the history of that organization.
Yeah. And so the specific source for a lot of these legislative models is the American Legislative Exchange Council, right? In other words, ALEC, A-L-E-C. And ALEC is, in this case of Walker, when he was a state representative, a state representative in, or as a state legislator in Wisconsin in the 1990s, he was basically wined and dined by the ALEC, by ALEC in order to present various
and
laws into.
For our audience, who ALEC? Let's explain what ALEC is. It's
Oh,
been around
I
since
see.
the
Right.
70s.
Right,
But
73, I think.
it's a fairly influential, very salient component of
Yes.
the conservative movement. In a way, it's the think tank. It's where the game plans come from.
The playbook.
The playbook.
Yeah.
And membership mostly, almost predominantly Republican, but it's those that are committed to more of a not necessarily libertarian, but again, the ethos of the conservative movement. It's where they transform or translate that into legislation, model legislation, and they're pretty aggressive at trying to get that adopted at a national level, but definitely down at the state
Right.
level.
If you go to their website, for example, the tagline or slogan that they have is limited government, free markets, federalism. And that's on the website, but I think they also sneak in their individual freedom occasionally. It came out, and ALEC was created in 1973. In fact, one of the key founders of ALEC was from Wisconsin, and a gentleman by the name of Paul Weyrich. So ALEC has a very long history in Wisconsin, of all places. Essentially, ALEC is kind of it's a centerpiece to a series of organizations, think tanks, like you mentioned, many of which have the same genesis, and from the early 1970s. And there was this, the Business Roundtable comes to mind, Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, American Enterprise Institute. Many of these institutions were created in the early to mid 1970s in anticipation of what became later known as the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, and they were there front and center for that. But they weren't simply riding in the wake of the Reagan Revolution. They, in fact, as it turned out, and by design, were making that revolution possible. And the historically speaking, ALEC doesn't come out of the blue. It's, like I said, it's by design, and historians have pointed to the famous memo by Lewis Powell, who later became a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, of the famous Powell memo of 1971 August, and basically stepping back and saying, we are under siege. The business community in this country the free enterprise system is under siege, and we must do something to push back against what he saw as the excesses of the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And what he interpreted as a profound questioning of the entire capitalist system. And so given that mentality, given that sense of embattlement, so to speak, or encirclement, the memo laid out in shocking detail, you could say, and this was a long memo sent to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, laying out how organizations such as ALEC should be created in order to push back and, in fact, to roll back the gains, the apparent gains of leftist politics.
And they've been fairly effective, I think, in doing so. Prolific with respect to, I think, within a few different areas, certainly rolling back the power of unions. There's definitely a suite of model legislation there.
Yep.
A lot of, again, tax code and tax reform legislation that's very popular. Our own Stand Your Ground law here in the state of Florida, which has become very, that's again another one that sort of has come out of model legislation from ALEC. And so as a vehicle of influence on the conservative side, I just want to highlight that this, again, it's a very influential group. It was part of, it's where I think a lot of that controversial Walker legislation came from. Today, is there anything on the left that, do progressives have something like an ALEC? Or do they not? Or are they getting sort of beat strategically?
Well, it's a tricky thing. I don't know that there is an answer to that, or I don't know that there is an obvious answer to that. The very way that you opened this talk, where you said, "Is this the start of a new era of corporate dominance?" I think you used this
Yeah,
phrase.
we can come back to that.
Right. You could argue that, well, the new era of corporate dominance was occurring in the 1970s in a kind of silent plutocrat's revolution, right? That then plays out in the national electoral scene by 1980 with Reagan, right? And then over the course of the 1980s through various policies under the Reagan era, and then over time, like I said with Governor Walker, he cut his teeth with ALEC legislation in the 1990s, right? So he has a long history with them personally, as do many other state legislators. There's something like 2,000 plus state legislators who are members of ALEC today, and then there are many alumni and at the federal level in U.S. Congress. I think it's 12 different governors are ALEC alumni, right? So step back a little bit. The nature of ALEC, there are two types of members in a sense for ALEC: the corporate donors and sponsors, and who pay the vast majority of the money into the budget for ALEC, and then about 2,000 state legislators around the 50 states. And the way I tend to think of it is ALEC is this kind of matchmaker, between these state legislators who don't have the time and resources and imagination to come up with these laws per se,
no.
and these corporations, their attorneys, their lobbyists, and they bring them together in the same room and they hash out this legislation, which then becomes a template for the other 50 states, the other 49 states, very often. So the claim is that they've had about 800 or so bills passed through their activities over the course of time. It's a lot of state laws.
Yeah.
And I could go into, if we had some time, we could go into some, laws that don't even seem to have anything to do with, say, union busting or other laws. For example, the Prison Industries Act, in the mid-1990s, which became a segue for the privatization of the prisons in the 1990s going into today. And that's another version of an ALEC legislative model that's been picked up around well over 25 states.
I would imagine, again,
and it goes on the list.
If I wanted to implement a governance agenda or a governance philosophy, I probably would try to establish something that looked like
this is
ALEC.
A very practical way of going about it. Yes, it is.
And getting back to the earlier question,
very targeted.
There's nothing quite comparable in the progressive movement at the moment. Certainly not anything as effective, but nothing quite as comparable in terms of that sort of organization, in terms of having sort of a catalog, a directory of model legislation, and you're just trying to...
It's funny, but when you look at the details of the Powell memo, for example, where he's getting all these ideas and details for what ALEC ought to do is an imitation of what the left had been successfully doing through the 1960s.
So why'd they stop?
And so that's a good question. And also they're looking at, well, the unions seem to be doing this fairly effectively, and the lobbying and so forth at the state level and through the 1950s and 1960s. Why can't business get its act together? That's the essential question Powell was asking in 1971, and so they did. So you could argue that they're
around.
Yeah, that they emulated the success of leftist politics, labor activism of the first half of the post-war era, so to speak, and so you have this, yeah, exactly, a kind of flipping and you have a kind of magnetic pole reversal in American politics, and it's not hard to point to the 1980 Reagan Revolution as the opening.
We've got a few minutes left. One of the things I did want to touch on, there was an editorial about a week ago from Tom Tryon in the Sarasota Herald, who was trying to make sense of the implications or significance of Wisconsin for Florida. He had 3 points that it wasn't going to be as significant. The first point was that some people were saying that other governors would be emboldened by what Walker was able to survive, and Scott doesn't need to be emboldened in terms of he's a very different context, very different setting in a way, less constraint on pushing his agenda. So he's been very aggressive. The second point, which I thought was very important, in terms of rolling back some of the protections of labor, Wisconsin's just coming back to where Florida is at the moment. So it's not as if we're already there in terms of what's happening in Wisconsin. And the third one I thought was perhaps most salient was with respect to Governor Scott, getting his agenda implemented and institutionalized. The check is not going to be sort of something at the election booth, but actually it's the Supreme Court review, especially with the automatic pension contributions and the COLA adjustments. And so you took a look at that. Any reaction to, you think that's accurate in terms of, don't read too much into this for Florida. There's a different set of dynamics here.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's a little too easy to turn the message or the meaning of Wisconsin into something much bigger than it really is, which is a confrontation between the present governor in Wisconsin, and unions in Wisconsin, especially public sector unions in Wisconsin. What will it mean for the election in 2012? What will it mean for Governor Scott in Florida? I don't know that it really means that much. Like you said, Florida was practically defined as a right-to-work state from the get-go, whereas Wisconsin has a completely different history. I don't think it's apples to oranges. I don't think it's quite like that, but and ALEC is able to operate very effectively in Wisconsin in some ways, and in similar ways and in very different ways in a state like Texas or Florida or Louisiana. So that it's not like they're unrelated, but I caution people who want to say that, and so in that sense, I agree with Tryon. I think that I don't think that there's a whole lot that could be learned from Wisconsin and applied to Florida, and I don't think it does much good.
Okay.
I think it just gets in the way. You know, Florida has a completely different labor context, especially, and the Supreme Court has a different relationship to the governor and to the legislature and to the laws being passed than, say, Wisconsin, and that's an important contextual difference.
I've got a minute left.
Wow.
Just parting thought with respect to, we're probably not going to go back to the heyday of union influence here in America, but where are we going? I don't think the unions are dead. It's a little bit of an overreaction.
No, yeah, they're not.
30 seconds.
Yeah, right. Well, a quick point that we talked about before is that in terms of electioneering, the rise of the religious right in particular, I think, is a really important part of this larger story.
Maybe I'll bring you back on.
Yeah, and so what I've been seeing, and but many historians have been able to look at, is that the kind of adoption of the religious right from the early 80s onward, the late 70s, early 80s onward, by the Republican Party, they now have troops on the ground at this point in 2012. They have troops on the ground, so to speak, to go out and work the phones and work the doors in the way that union members used to do it, and still do it now, but really used to do it 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? So part of that interesting dynamic there is the religious right kind of stepping in.
We've teed up another show.
I know.
We're out of time. But I'd like to thank our viewers for tuning in this week, and we'll catch you again next week on another edition of Focus One.